Mea culpa. I pissed off a few people on Monday and Wednesday's shows by appearing to downplay the nastiness of Keir Starmer's immigration speech. And we got a few thoughtful emails about it. And to be honest, on this one, I think you guys were right and I was wrong. So I still think what Starmer was saying about an island of strangers was a million miles from what Enoch Powell was saying when he used the word, just the word, in his River of Blood speech. But that did distract me from the other things Keir Starmer said, namely that a period of high immigration was a squalid chapter that caused incalculable harm. A squalid chapter, very unpleasant word. Well, squalid is very unpleasant, isn't it? An incalculable harm. Clearly, to say that about a period of high immigration is yeah, I mean, it's wrong. It's factually wrong. Right? Yeah, that's caused incalculable harm. Very different to any other policy. Very much what Ash was talking about on Wednesday. This is to say that Ash was correct on Wednesday and I was wrong. I suppose where I was coming from, I tend to think that on both sides of the political divide, people are quite quick to sort of scream offence and to sort of say, you've used the wrong word because it can be interpreted this way or that way. And I think that has a tendency to sort of heighten polarisation and make everyone a bit more stressed and miserable than they need to be. But in this case, I think people's anger about this speech was warranted on second thoughts. I think also I tend to think that there is, or particularly on the left, the moment anyone suggests there might be some challenges as well as benefits to immigration, to say that's beyond the pale, which I think is a mistake. But again, the language Keir Starmer used in this speech, on reflection, went way beyond that. Aaron, we're going to talk about some of the political impact of this speech in a moment. First of all, we haven't done a show together since he made it. What are your thoughts after having let this sink in?
Well, I watched the show on Wednesday, Michael, with you and Ash. I thought it was a really outstanding conversation. I agreed with much of what Ash said. I wasn't quite where you were, but I was sympathetic to the arguments you were making. But I think Ash is correct in so much as, in many ways, the worst parts of his speech wasn't necessarily that word, strangers, which attracted the most anger. Squalid, incalculable, and talking about these things purely in relation to migration. As Ash said, he has never used the word squalid in regard to feces and detritus being pumped into our waterways and oceans as a result of privatized water companies. He's never talked about the incalculable damage of austerity or privatization. If he has, in a hallmark speech, I'm really happy to be corrected. I've never seen it. So he was using a tone of language, which is actually quite unlike Keir Starmer. He's quite a boring guy. He doesn't like emotional language. And he was reaching for an emotional tone of language you very rarely see with him on no other policy topic. And to use it here alongside, I think, the intentional deployment of that word strangers, to echo Enoch Powell. I don't think the speech was like Powell's speech in 1968, but I think the point was to echo that word and to start a fight with the left. As you said, Michael, I think that certainly was the intention. But I do think there was also something really distinct and nasty about what he was doing. And it's particularly aggravating, Michael, because it's coming from a politician who claims to champion diversity, who claims to be anti-racist. You know, if Nigel Farage or Rupert Lowe or Richard Tice say that, you say, well, look, that's always been their political beliefs. That's basically their brand of politics. They are very open in rejecting immigration policy. That's what they've done. But then you have something like Keir Starmer as recently as 2020 saying that immigration is not the reason for decline in public services. It's not the reason for the housing crisis. It's not the reason for crumbling public services. He's now saying the complete opposite in the most emotional possible register. And I think, frankly, Michael, it's disgusting. He's a disgusting man. He doesn't believe in anything. As I've said, I mean, I genuinely, I'm now at the point where I have more respect for Richard Tice or Nigel Farage or Zia Yusuf, or there's no consistent Conservatives, to be quite frank. Maybe you might say Jacob Rees-Mogg, he doesn't seem to change. I have more respect for those people than for Keir Starmer. I really wonder what Keir Starmer would say no to at this point. You know, what political position or what rhetoric would he say no to if he thought it could save his political career? And it really is extraordinary, Michael. Just zone out for a second, take a step back. A week after they had this huge defeat, the man is, I don't like the word hate because I don't think anybody should hate anybody. He's powerfully disliked by tons of the electorate. A week later, he points the finger at migrants. And that, to me, whether you're pro-migration or you're anti-migration, I think most people would agree that is the hallmark of a very cowardly man, a really cowardly, despicable act, in my view. And I think one of the advantages of a politician like Keir Starmer is meant to be you have these conversations in a way which is moderately technocratic. You listen to people and you take the heat out. If somebody wants to say, look, we should have a migration policy where it's net migration of 250,000 a year, here's why, or 100,000, whatever, but they do it in a way where you're taking the heat out, I much prefer that to somebody like Keir Starmer saying, I'm pro-diversity, let's go on a pride march, I love immigration, I'm having a vegetarian curry, but it was a despicable, incalculable episode. He's adding to the fire. He's putting kerosene on it. He's not trying to cool things down, which is meant to be a part of his political brand. The point is he can't really do that with any kind of charisma or political pull. So they're having to do this instead. I know that we're going to now talk about some of the consequences of that. It's not been as advantageous politically as some of his advisors might have thought. Who would have guessed Morgan McSweeney, the man who advised Liz Kendall in 2015, the man involved in a campaign which got 4.5% of Labour supporters to back it, Labour members rather, to back it. Who would have thought this person actually isn't necessarily as smart as the whole media seem to make out? I'd like to say this as well. Dominic Cummings is a damn sight smarter than Morgan McSweeney. And as we know, he got eaten for breakfast. I wonder where Mr. McSweeney will be in 12 months' time.
Well, I was going to say Keir Starmer's no Boris Johnson, but neither of them were. One of them was a much better communicator than the other. I imagine they're both equally. I don't know. I was listening to an interview. Who was it with? Sam Friedman, where he was sort of saying Dominic Cummings and Morgan McSweeney, both of them seem to think that sort of they're the power behind the throne, but ultimately it will always be the political leader who gets the final say. And so the moment you fall out, it's going to be you, not them, who's out. With Keir Starmer, I feel like Keir Starmer without Morgan McSweeney is going to be even more rudderless than Boris Johnson without Dominic Cummings was, but we'll see. But yeah, it doesn't seem to be going very well. So clearly they made this speech with some of these sort of phrases that could be interpreted in very sinister ways. And some of them, as I say, very bad language, squalid, incalculable harm. They used those because they wanted a row. Now, you would imagine that would mean that they'd sort of said, well, this is an issue that we think we can get on the front foot on this week. But it does seem to be another example of Labour being all over the place. So the Albania trip just seemed completely weird and pointless. So there was a pointless plan, I think, to set up return hubs for failed asylum seekers. You can deport failed asylum seekers anyway. It didn't make any sense. And then what was worse, well, from a PR perspective, is that the Albanians said, we don't want this anyway. So why make the trip? The Prime Minister making a trip to Albania and then having nothing to announce. Very, very strange. The party do also just seem to have a pretty flawed analysis of the electorate. So Politics Home had a report yesterday on a top Starmer aide claiming reform voters are Labour people who are just pissed off. The quotes were from Claire Reynolds, who is Labour's political director, and she was giving a briefing following the Runcorn, so the by-election, and the local election losses. So this is from that article from Politics Home. At the meeting, MPs were shown private polling that indicated Farage's Reform UK was able to mobilise habitual non-voters in Runcorn, while Labour voters stayed at home. Reynolds said, Reform voters are not necessarily right-wing. They are people and they are pissed off. Now, there's a very strange passage because the first paragraph contradicts the second paragraph. So you're saying Reform voters are not necessarily right-wing. They just are people who are pissed off. But then before that, the presentation she's supposed to have shown, this advisor, said that Farage won because Reform managed to turn out non-voters and Labour voters stayed at home. So again, I'm sympathetic to the idea that Labour have to try and peel off some Reform voters. Unless they peel off a sliver of Reform voters or a sliver of Tory voters, then it's going to be very difficult to win in those constituencies, which is the majority of constituencies, frankly, where people are sceptical about migration. So you're going to have to peel off some of those. But if you see Reform voters as your, as your natural voters, beyond sort of peeling off a sliver who you might be able to reassure, well, that's what they're doing, and it's not going very well. This, though, I thought was really embarrassing for Labour. So it's from that same article. Reynolds also admitted to MPs that Labour's vision for Britain is a work in progress, according to Labour backbenchers at the meeting, who was being the people who were being spoken to. So this is a government who's been in office for a year. Keir Starmer was obviously leader of the opposition for 5 years. The whole sort of point of attacking the left and kicking them out of the party was to say that we're a party of government. And then a year in government, they still haven't worked out what they're for, what they want to do. So they can't, it's not that they can't communicate to the public what their vision is. They can't communicate to their own MPs what their vision is because they haven't got one. This is also really disastrous for Keir Starmer personally. So this is the difference between his favourability among the general public and then among supporters of each party, the supporters of who people voted for in 2024. And what you'll see at the top is people being polled in mid-April, and then the next thing you're seeing is people being polled in the middle of this week in mid-May. And this is really disastrous for Starmer because among all Britons, he's gone from minus 34, so favourable, only 28%, 62% saying unfavourable. So that was in April, minus 34, and now he's gone to minus 46. The fall has been particularly catastrophic among Labour voters. So just a month ago, he had a favourability, sort of net favourability rating of plus 29. So 29, so the 62% of people had a favourable opinion of him, and 33% had an unfavourable opinion among Labour voters. So Labour voters were still happy with him, even if no one else was. But now even Labour voters don't like the guy. So he's now on minus 5. So he's down 34 points in a month among Labour voters. And then this is the really catastrophic bit if he was trying to peel off Reform voters, because in April, 93% of Reform voters had a negative view of him. Only 4% had a positive view. Now, you might think, surely it can't get much worse than that. Well, fast forward a month, and now 96% of Reform voters have a negative view of Starmer, and only 2% have a positive view. So he's on minus 94 among Reform voters. I suppose the things that have happened in that month were the local election losses that have made sort of Starmer look ineffective. If you're a Labour voter, you want the leader of your party to be ineffective. But also you've had sort of discussion of the PIP cuts, and then you've had the Island of Strangers speech. That's disastrous. And Starmer appears to be willing to take desperate measures. So according to the newspaper, Number 10 are in accelerated talks about reversing last year's cuts to the winter fuel payment. So the report in the paper says this. Talks in Number 10 about abandoning the policy have accelerated this week after focus groups indicated voters would not necessarily bear a grudge against the government if it performed a partial or full U-turn. They go on to say this. The paper understands the government is considering whether to increase the £11,500 income threshold over which pensioners are no longer eligible for the allowance to bring more people into the benefits net. Also being discussed, but extremely unlikely to be agreed, is to reverse the policy altogether. And so presumably, if they sort of have it so that more people get the winter fuel payment by heightening the threshold for getting pensioners credit, this whole sort of ordeal, as well as costing them loads and loads of support, could presumably cost the Treasury money, because if this is going to mean that more people get pension credit, then presumably that's going to cost quite a lot of money for the rather small savings they made on the winter fuel payments. Aaron, lots to comment on here. I mean, it's not looking good, is it?
The idea that this could end up being revenue negative is just, it defies belief, Michael. I mean, I can't think of anything. I can't think of a political own goal like this in my lifetime. I know we look, we have to talk on this show every day, every week about stuff, and it's often a big deal, but people like to be hyperbolic or they're stuck in the moment. I'm being deadly serious. This is without doubt the most disastrous, unforced political own goal in my lifetime. It was only meant to raise £1.4 billion a year. It had a massive political overhead for them. It was told to me by absolutely every single last person I met in Runcorn, whether or not they were planning to vote for the Labour Party. You had that great line over the following weekend given to the Financial Times by Labour MPs saying it was the decisive original sin of this government. It was a whose side are you on moment? And we told them, we're not on your side. They did all that for £1.4 billion, obviously never worth it. Now, if they go back on it, the idea that it's going to be revenue negative for the Treasury when the country already has a massive deficit, Rachel Reeves already has to look absolutely everywhere. I mean, Michael, this might end up being, a couple of hundred million or whatever revenue negative. People are going to lose benefits. People are seeing various tax thresholds being frozen. So you're running more money, you get pushed up into a higher band. To cover the arse of Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer monumentally screwing this up. I mean, it's just incredible. It's absolutely incredible. And I think we've just had one set of local elections, obviously. I think we're going to have another in May 2026, which is going to see elections to the Senedd, to Holyrood in Scotland, local elections across England in many authorities where Labour are presently often the only party or the only major party. Every single local authority across Greater London, across the West Midlands, Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds. I suspect, Michael, I mean, if he lasts that long, by the way, and I think Starmer will last that long, but you look at some of the data you just showed there, I mean, I don't know how he does, frankly, but let's say he does last that long. I don't really see how he survives for very long after those local elections, because then you've got, 400 plus MPs. They're going to lose at least half of them. People's self-preservation instincts start to kick in. The question is, who's going to replace him? There's no obvious candidate with a large parliamentary majority of their own. I mean, Wes Streeting's probably going to lose his seat, right? So if anything, that's the only thing that will keep Starmer in place, I think, till next May. But after next May, I suspect he's toast. I mean, we had a great Plaid Cymru MP on this week. They're leading in some polls for the Senedd. If Labour lose Wales, it's just extraordinary. I mean, that's a bigger heartland for them than anywhere in England. Anywhere in England. People talk about the Red Wall, etc. Wales has been a one-party political state since, for 100 years. For 100 years, Labour has been the biggest party in Wales. To lose that would just be utterly extraordinary. I suspect the English sort of media class won't really understand the significance and the scale of that, but it would be something to behold. And they would really be reduced to a rump party in Greater London and the wealthier parts of the Northwest. That's what Labour would become. Except, of course, those places are also going to be exposed to challenges from Greens and from independents as well. So really, really, really extraordinary data. I think you said 96%, Michael, of Reform voters, don't approve of the guy. 96%, and your entire political messaging is to get those people on board. They fucking hate you. I wonder at what point do him and the retinue around him start to think, actually, this probably isn't a particularly smart strategy. I understand the fact that because of our political geography in this country, you do need to win those swing voters in those seats, which are increasingly reform curious. I get it. But when you're hemorrhaging twice as many voters to the Lib Dems and the Greens as you are to reform, and I think, if anything, that's probably accelerated in the last month. That's certainly what that polling indicates. You have major problems. You have major problems. Is anyone in his sort of inner circle smart enough to discern this? Because if you say that and you say, look, we were wrong, like you did on the show this evening, Michael, I was wrong. First of all, you have to be quite, have to have a bit of gumption about you to do that. Secondly, it would be really at odds with their entire worldview. Their entire worldview was to go right, attack the left, win the center, you get to power. That's their worldview. And actually what they need to do now, which is consolidate their centre-left vote, and they've clearly got to offer something to reform voters, clearly got to offer something. I think the problem for them is, even if you want to do that, Starmer's not the messenger. Surprise, surprise, a human rights lawyer who represents a constituency in North London, who sounds more adenoidal than a bunged-up child who hasn't seen Vicks Vapor Rub for a fortnight. Surprise, surprise, he won't appeal to those people. They're not his people. He's not their man.
Let's focus on reform for a moment. So we don't want to get carried away with sort of Schadenfreude about Keir Starmer failing without sort of being clear about what the most likely alternative is at the moment. Reform, of course, I partly because they've risen so quickly, partly because political journalism isn't necessarily all it's cracked up to be, haven't been subject to much scrutiny. But it is worth reiterating, they are pretty wacky. This is what their deputy leader, Richard Tice, said this week to the BBC about climate change.
You can't stop climate change. And this, I think, is the big lie. Climate change has gone on for millions of years and always will.
You're not just having an argument about how we do net zero. You're actually having an argument about whether we should bother at all. Not just because China's bigger and India's bigger. You're basically saying to the country, it's all guff. David Attenborough's talking nonsense. 1,000 scientists are talking nonsense. 99% of climate change scientists, they're all talking nonsense.
And again,
I know better.
And that's a nonsense figure. That 99% figure is a nonsense figure. The reality is, I can give you a list of 1,000 scientists who disagree. Science is never settled. It always evolves. But here's the point.
Most of those scientists, I think, I know who you're referring to, and they're not climate change scientists, are they?
There's plenty who are. There are professors with Nobel Prize winning professors of physics and engineering who take this view. Look, the point is, you can't stop climate change. And this, I think, is the big lie. Climate change has gone on for millions of years and always will. What you can do, and I think the smart thing to do, is to adapt to it. My issue is that net zero is the wrong thing, the wrong time, at the wrong price.
I mean, it's very like the wacky end of the Republican Party, but Reform clearly think they're onto something with sort of attacking net zero. Apparently that electorally doesn't make much sense because it's a sort of one-to-one ratio of that there's no one who isn't already reform curious and really angry about migration that also really cares about net zero is what I read. I'm not an expert on this, obviously. But the idea of saying climate change doesn't really exist. It's not really made by humans. The scientists disagree. Like we settled that about 15 years ago. What are they thinking? Like, why can't they just be a single issue party who are kind of normal but really want to stop migration? Why does it always have to come in this? I'm not saying I would like that party, but I just mean if you were an electoral strategist, surely the most sensible thing for Reform to do would just be really against migration and then be kind of normal in other respects. But they can't help but be really cranky on a bunch of issues.
Well, on this, Michael, look, there's been an energy crisis in this country. The cost of industrial energy is some of the highest in the world. And they need an explanation for that, of course. And an explanation which blames the other side. So politically, it's quite useful for them. Although, of course, I agree with you. Quickly on the science, the last time we had this much atmospheric CO2 on our planet, sea levels were 40 to 60 meters higher. 40 to 60 meters higher. The last time the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, you've got CO2, nitrogen, argon, oxygen, etc. It's composite. But the last time there was that much CO2, sea levels were 60 meters higher. I think if the sea levels were 5 meters higher, maybe 10 meters higher, 10 meters, I'd probably be underwater, I think, here, Michael. So I think probably in where you are in South London, I think you probably would be too. 10 meters is quite a lot. With the Thames, even with the Thames flood barrier. So 40 to 60 meters higher puts, I think, most of the world's major cities underwater by a long way. We should take that seriously. In the whole history of primates, Michael, forget human beings, in the history of primates, we haven't had this much CO2 on our atmosphere. So then the question comes down to the timeline, right? We know what happens when you have changing composition of your atmosphere like this, what it does to warming. This is all proven with regards to causal mechanisms. You do X, you get Y outcome. We know that. You're going to get planetary warming. The question is how quickly. That's the big question. And look, this planet, Michael, is 5 billion years old. When you're talking about planetary environmental systems, the margin of error being 1,000 years is actually quite a small thing. Of course, in politics, if I said this is going to happen for 1,000 years, it's never going to happen. If I'm saying it's happening next year, that's a huge deal. And of course, if you're out by 10 years, then you're redundant. You don't know what you're talking about. But the causal mechanisms and what is almost inevitable is understood, not up for debate. There has not been this much CO2 in the atmosphere in the history of primates. Okay? If we go above 2 degrees C, very plausibly, you then go to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6. You create a bunch of feedbacks with regards to methane hydrate coming out of the oceans, with regards to permafrost melting, methane coming out of principally Siberia. If you get rid of the Amazon, has a massive impact on the global hydrogen cycle, in terms of it sequestering CO2, giving out oxygen, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a bunch of things that feed into one another, past 2 degrees, we're in big trouble. We're in big trouble. I mean, we're already in big trouble at 1.5, but after 2, you're in really big trouble. And what Richard Tice is effectively saying is that it doesn't matter we've got more CO2 in our atmosphere than in the history of primates. It doesn't matter the last time we were here, water levels were 60 meters higher. It doesn't matter that 2 degrees could become 3, 4, 5, 6. The planet will literally be uninhabitable for our species. None of that matters because I won't be alive. I won't be here. And we owe the future something, Michael. We owe our kids something. We owe our grandchildren something. But we also know people beyond that something too. Everybody watching or listening to this will have used antibiotics, I think, more or less, right? The leading cause of death for human beings 100, 120 years ago was infection, bacterial infection. The leading cause of death, whether that was from an injury or in childbirth or, pneumonia, the leading cause of death that is completely eviscerated as a fundamental reality of the human experience by antibiotics, save hundreds of millions, maybe billions of lives, right? Billions of lives. I'm very grateful for the people involved in that research, Michael, all the way from Alexander Fleming all the way through to the US Army in the Second World War, creating the supply chains to build that stuff out to make antibiotics really cheap, penicillin really cheap. I'm really grateful for those people because they saved my life. I would have died, I'm sure. By now, I'm 41. I would have died without antibiotics, I'm pretty sure. So I'm very grateful for those people and what they did. We stand on the consequences of their actions. The same applies, of course, for people in the future. And I find it remarkable. We have inherited such an incredible planet. We live within a context of culture and tradition, language, technology, which we've inherited from other people. And yet, because of the political cultural moment we live in, when we think about our descendants, we think, fuck them. Fuck them. Oh, well, I won't be here. And it's a toxic and actually quite new way to think. It's a very new way to think, in fact. And I'll finish with this. For people like Richard Tice and Reform, for them, climate change means, I'll get a Pinot Noir from the New Forest. Kentish white wine, sparkling white from Kent will be fantastic. Will be better than the stuff you get from the Champagne region. But that isn't where it stops, okay? That's what it maybe feels like now or in 10 years' time. That isn't where it stops. It potentially stops in the Gulf Stream disappearing and Britain having a climate like North Norway, okay? That's where it potentially stops. It potentially stops, like I say, with 6 degrees warming 100 years, 200 years from now, and literally anything with lungs can't breathe. It ends in the lifetime of my grandchildren with every major Western city being underwater. All plausible. These are plausible things. They might not happen, but that again goes back to my point about antibiotics. Maybe somebody will figure it out with regards to bacteria. No, somebody did figure it out. They took action. They did it. They built something, and all of us owe them a huge debt of gratitude. We owe the future something too.